Hello, my name is Terry McGuire. I'm a member of the Canada Underground Railroad Center, um, and I'm here to share with you a presentation about a very important meeting that took place in June of 1862 between a bunch of local Quakers, six of them, in fact, and the president, Abraham Lincoln. Uh, I'm going to be sharing a screen at the moment with a PowerPoint, and let's see how well this works. Okay. There we go. Now, would prefer, I have found in doing this that I prefer to be doing the voiceover, but not looking at myself. I feel somewhat self-conscious, especially for a teacher who's had 44 years at it, but nonetheless, I'm going to get rid of myself and just do the voiceover. Thank you. Bye-bye. So this is a presentation on behalf of the Canada Underground Railroad Center. That's an organization that was founded about 22 years ago. And our purpose, our aim, our mission is to preserve the heritage and engage the public about the historic abolitionists and freedom seekers of this area and beyond. On June 20th, 1862, a contingent of Quakers from this area met with Lincoln at the White House. Besides being Quakers, they had something else in common. They were troublemakers, and they had been for a long time. At least 5 of them had broken the law of the land. In fact, quite often. They were either conductors of the Underground Railroad, folks who guided freedom seekers from safe home to safe home, or they were station keepers, those who hosted these freedom seekers. And they were in the White House to urge President Lincoln to use his then considerable wartime powers to grant freedom to millions of African Americans enslaved at the time. Just over a month later, on July 22nd, Lincoln shared with his cabinet the first draft of what was to become the Emancipation Proclamation. Who were these people? And did they really have such an influence on one of the most important decisions in American history? This is a map of our area created for the Canada Underground Railroad Center, and it has the pictures of various station keepers and people who were involved in the Underground Railroad. Dinah and Isaac Mendenhall were there. These are the Bernards. This is John and Hannah Cox. This is Thomas Garrett. We'll hear more about him. And these are the places where fugitives, freedom seekers came and were able to stay for a brief amount of time before moving on. Now, they were mostly from Chester County, these 6 people, and they were ardent supporters of the Underground Railroad. One of them, Eliza Agnew, is not known to have been either a conductor or a station keeper, but her parents and her 2 brothers were quite active in such efforts in Pennsbury, which is here. I keep hitting the wrong thing. Another, Alice Eliza Hambleton, had brothers, 3 of them involved in Underground Railroad activities, and she and her husband maintained a station of their own in Upper Oxford County. Now we'll see that building. This is Marlborough Friends Meeting. It was founded in 1801, and another of the delegation, William Bernard, was a member of that little meeting. Or at least he was until Bernard attended, until it became abundantly clear that his abolitionist fervor and illegal activities were aggravating his fellow members. At some point, William Bernard invited Oliver Johnson, an abolitionist progressive friend from New York State who had recently relocated to Eastern Pennsylvania. He invited him to speak at the Marlborough meeting, but other meeting members objected when Johnson stood up to speak. Eventually, Johnson and 5 members of the meeting were arrested by a constable who'd been brought in by the conservative meeting members. All of them were fined, although only Johnson actually paid the fine. Now, bringing the law down on a Quaker for sharing his or her thoughts in meeting was very unusual. This event, incidentally, is known in Quaker history as the Marlborough Riot, though for most of us, the word riot connotes something much more violent and noisy. Nonetheless, for several abolitionist friends of Marlborough meeting, this was an affront too great to bear. They decided in 1853 to resign their membership to Marlborough and help to create a new meeting, the Longwood Progressive Meeting for Friends. The Longwood Progressive Meeting, oh, incidentally, this is now with a porch added to it, the Chester County Visitors Bureau. It's owned by Longwood Gardens. The Longwood Progressive Meeting for Friends soon became a forum of discussion for abolition, for women's suffrage, and all manner of reform movements in the 19th century. Oliver Johnson was also a founding member of this meeting, and Johnson was one of the delegates to the White House. Another founding member of the Longwood Progressive Meeting and a delegate to the White House on June 20th was Dinah Mendenhall. Her husband Isaac and she were among the foremost, most active members of the Underground Railroad in Chester County, hosting a great many people. They often received and sheltered and moved along freedom seekers from Delaware's Thomas Garrett, whom we'll hear more about later, who was married to a cousin of Isaac's, Rachel Mendenhall Garrett. Isaac was read out of meeting. That's like being excommunicated from your parish for the same kind of relentless activity and advocacy of abolition and the Underground Railroad. John and Hannah Cox were also major station masters in the Underground Railroad. They assisted in gaining the freedom of over 300 fugitives. Once they were visited by 18 in a single time. They were also read out of Friends meeting. They contributed land to the Longwood Progressive Meeting and likewise were very great troublemakers and busy agents of the Underground Railroad. Thomas Garrett of Wilmington was the 6th member, and at 73, he was the oldest person among them, perhaps the oldest living agent of the Underground Railroad. Garrett is a fascinating individual. Over the course of a long career, he is thought to have assisted 2,700 fugitives to safety. He had decided early in his adulthood that to do so was his life's work. He was a merchant, yes, and he was a family man and a father, but from the 1820s on, he was aiding Black Americans, either escaped slaves, wrongly accused free Blacks, to secure their freedom. Once he was caught in the act and put on trial in the town of Newcastle, Delaware. The judge was no less than the Chief Justice of the National Supreme Court, Roger B. Taney. Not surprisingly, Garrett was found guilty. He was fined $5,400, about his entire net worth. When he was asked by Taney if he had learned his lesson, Garrett responded, "Judge, he has left me not $1, but I wish to say to thee and all in this court, if anyone knows a fugitive who wants a shelter and a friend, to send him to Thomas Garrett, and he will befriend him." Garrett was nonviolent, but very bold and constantly active, resourceful, and determined. This is Wilmington Monthly Meeting, where which was Garrett's home meeting, they also were displeased with his activity and his trial, the fact that he'd essentially become bankrupt. There was some discussion about reading him out of the meeting, but no such action was taken. Nonetheless, Garrett often chose to attend meeting at with the Longwood Progressive folks. Now, one might get the impression from our comments that the local Quakers were not really strong abolitionists. To use the modern phrase, they seem to have talked the talk but not walked the walk. However, Quakers were very uneasy about getting involved in politics and had been so for about a century. When Quakers were in charge of Pennsylvania in the mid 18th century, they ran into conflict with the non-Quakers, who greatly outnumbered them, about using armed forces to protect themselves from the Indians and the French. Most Quakers just decided to retreat from public involvement. Now, this view seems contrary to one's impressions of Quakers today. They're deeply immersed in social issues. Quakers oppose such things as US military involvement, capital punishment, racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on. Such was not the case in the early and mid 19th century. Quakers not only dressed like the Amish, but they had the same sense that they should be separate from society as a whole, concerned only with their own kind. By contrast, the Longwood Progressive Meeting friends, these people, welcomed all manner of social reformers who were not Quakers to speak to at their meeting. However much Quakers might admire William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Susan B. Anthony, and the like, they did not want to open up their first day worship to non-Quakers. Their primary concerns were spiritual and moral, not social. Chester County had a great many. Let me get back to that. A great many active agents in the Underground Railroad, but they represented a distinct minority among Quakers and a far smaller portion of the Chester County population as a whole. The Longwood Progressive Meeting, however, consisted of many of those friends who differed from the majority and were committed to social action and change. It was they who assembled this committee to visit the White House. The delegation consisted of 3 men and 3 women attesting to the Quaker belief in the equality of women. 3 congressmen and 1 senator, David Wilmot, all from Pennsylvania, led the delegation into the White House to introduce the 6 to the president. It's another picture of Oliver Johnson. He was a journalist from New York City, and he was chosen to read what was called a memorial to the president. A memorial was used then as we would use the word petition today. The group was aware of the aggravation that Lincoln had endured from office seekers, constantly badgering him for offices, or for this privilege, that privilege. And they assured him that they were not seeking favors for themselves or their friends, quote, for themselves or their friends, but in the interest of the country and of humanity. Our clients are 4 million slaves who cannot speak for themselves, but only lift up their chained hands in mute but agonizing supplication for freedom, which is in your power in this solemn crisis of the nation's fate to confer upon them. The memorial reminded the president of a passage from a speech he had delivered in Springfield, Illinois in 1858. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. It will become one or all of the other. The delegation seemed politically savvy enough to realize the opportunity that the Civil War had presented to Lincoln. He had emergency powers to do things that in most circumstances, no presidents could do. They urged him to use those powers to issue orders of widespread emancipation. Now, Lincoln was gracious to these visitors, but he did not quickly yield to their reasoning. He noted that the quote from the Springfield speech omitted another passage in which he stated that the American people would either agree to slavery's extinction or they would agree to its inclusion in all states. Lincoln didn't suggest the decision would necessarily be the elimination of slavery. And here's a reason why. Lincoln also knew that at issue was not only the effectiveness of issuing a decree about people living in states over which he had no control because they had seceded. He was acutely aware of the delicate balance of maintaining support for the Union from the border states that had not seceded. And those are the ones that you can see here. Missouri, Kentucky, that part of Virginia, which eventually became West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. All of the states allowed slavery. Though Delaware, for example, had comparatively few slaves by 1861, slightly more than 1,000, it was certainly not because Delawareans favored abolition. They did not. Lincoln had disappointed many abolitionists already by placing the preservation of the Union higher than his moral obligation to slavery, moral objection to slavery, excuse me. In response to an editorial to that effect by the newspaper editor and magnate Horace Greeley, Lincoln wrote the following passage. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. It is said that the delegation of 6 left the audience with Lincoln gratified at his graciousness, but unsure that they had any impact. Did they have any impact? This is the cover of a book by a very distinguished Columbia University professor, Eric Foner. And he won the Pulitzer Prize for this, and I believe for other things as well. This is a very thorough study of Lincoln's transition from caution to determination on the issue of emancipation. Foner entitled one chapter by a quote from Lincoln, "I must have Kentucky." Clearly, Lincoln worried about the secession rebellion growing larger. Foner cites a conversation that Lincoln had with Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, an ardent abolitionist, that if he acceded to Sumner's suggestion that he announce emancipation on July 4th, 1862, quote, half the army would lay down their arms and 3 other states would join the rebellion. Foner, incidentally, in his 345-page volume, makes but one reference to Lincoln's meeting with a, quote, delegation of Quakers, but offers no names. This is the cover of Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals that became the basis of the movie Lincoln that came out in 2012. In her much larger work, about twice as large, Doris Kearns Goodwin makes an even briefer reference to Lincoln's having, quote, granted an audience to a group of Quakers, including Eliza Gurney, who was not one of the 6 that we've talked about so far. But that interview occurred very early in 1862. She makes no reference at all to the June 20th meeting. Perhaps the urgings of Garrett, Agnew, Mendenhall, Hamilton, Johnston, and Bernard had little effect upon this issue. And yet, 32 days later, after that meeting, Lincoln shared the first draft of the proclamation. Exactly 2 months after that draft, on September 22nd, he issued the proclamation, which was to take place on January 1st, 1863. It is true that only the week before, Union forces had won a very important battle at Antietam in Maryland. And Lincoln had indicated to his cabinet that the Union Army had to have a victory before he issued the proclamation. After all, it would have seemed absurd to be making the claim of freeing slaves in seceding state when there was no prospect of the Union winning the war. But to return to the fiery trial, Lincoln in 1854, in a speech in Peoria, Illinois, enumerated all the reasons for which he hated slavery. However, he could not, at that time, he explained, he could not countenance the possibility of regarding emancipated African Americans as, quote, politically and socially our equals. My own feelings would not admit of this, and if mine did, we well know that the great mass of white people will not. Early in the Civil War, even after he drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln was looking into the possibility of transporting freed African Americans, possibly to Liberia in Africa, or at least to some Caribbean destinations. To summarize generally, Foner sees the actions of free and freed African American soldiers as having had a profound effect on Lincoln. He was moved by their courage, their zeal, and the great weight of their contribution to the Union effort. Known as the United States Colored Troops, they eventually represented 10% of the Union Army. And they also had a 35% higher casualty rate than their white Union counterparts. The Congressional Medal of Honor was awarded to 15 soldiers of the USC team. By early 1865, until his death that April, Abraham Lincoln was advocating and planning for that political and social equality for Black people that just a decade earlier he had cringed from. Perhaps these few Quakers we spoke of may have swayed Lincoln towards accepting the idea of the Emancipation Proclamation. But it was the determination and dedication of African Americans to the concept of freedom that helped Lincoln evolve from a cautious abolitionist to a person who truly believed that the Declaration of Independence applied to all Americans, regardless of color. If you have any questions, I could urge you to contact us by our at our website and our email. And you could email us at info@kennedyundergroundrr.org. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.